Thank you so much, Judge Laffoy, for that very kind introduction. I might apologise first if I sound nasal in this presentation. Like everyone else in the country this weekend, I have a cold, so my apologies for that. Try and get through it. I was asked today to give you a broad and general introduction to the lawmaking process, to how laws are made and changed, and to the Constitution's role in that process. And I think the key point I hope you will take away from this presentation is this. The Constitution empowers lawmaking, but it also restrains it. And it is those two elements, the empowerment and the restraint, that I hope to deal with in the course of my short presentation today. First, to talk about how the Constitution empowers lawmaking. It does so in Article 15.2, important provision of the Constitution, which says the sole and exclusive power of making laws for the state is vested in the Oireachtas. And there are three things I think we might take from this. First of all, lawmaking power comes from the Constitution, and so the validity, the legitimacy of laws flows from the fact that they are authorised by the Constitution. Secondly, the Oireachtas, and only the Oireachtas, makes laws for the state. It is nobody else's job. And thirdly, this is a broad grant of power. The Constitution envisages that, in principle, the Oireachtas can make any law it wishes on any topic at any time. It's given a broad power to do this. But, and it's a very significant but, only insofar as the laws that are made or changed accord with the Constitution. Since the Constitution gives this power, it must be exercised subject to the Constitution, and it cannot violate the provisions of the Constitution. And we know this from another important provision, Article 15.4, which says the Oireachtas shall not enact any law which is in any respect repugnant to, that is, incompatible with, the Constitution. And there are three kinds of restraints that the Constitution imposes on how laws are made and changed. First of all, the Oireachtas must follow a particular process for how laws are made. And we'll discuss that in just a moment. But also the Oireachtas is prohibited specifically from doing certain things in law. To take one simple example, Article 15.5 says the Oireachtas cannot impose the death penalty by law. That is something that it cannot constitutionally do. So some things are very clearly stated to be beyond the powers of the Oireachtas. But also, the Oireachtas must not breach any of the broader constitutional guarantees. The Constitution guarantees many values and structures, and the laws the Oireachtas passes must respect those. Perhaps most importantly, that includes the personal rights that we all enjoy under the Constitution. Rights to life, private property, liberty, good name. These are all protected for us, and the laws the Oireachtas passes must not unfairly take away those rights. And we'll come back toward the end of the presentation to look at how these restraints operate in practice. But before we do that, we have to deal with how laws are actually made, this process for making law under the Constitution. How do we make a law? How do we change a law? And I've gone into some detail about this in the paper that was circulated to you in advance of this presentation. But for the purpose of summarising it here, let's take a hypothetical bill that we might want to pass. We'll call it the Housing Bill 2017. And let's imagine that we wanted to pass this bill in order to address a problem with housing being highly priced or undersupplied. I don't know where I took this example from, it's entirely hypothetical. So let's imagine that we wanted to pass a bill like that. How would we go about doing that? We would have to undergo a three-step process that the Constitution sets out. Step number one, we need to pass the bill through one house of the Oireachtas. So we would introduce the bill in one of the houses of the Oireachtas. Usually, bills are first introduced in the Dáil. Not always, but usually. So let's imagine that's what happens here. We introduce the bill in the Dáil, the People's House, elected by all of us, citizens of voting age. Typically, bills will be introduced by the minister in charge of the relevant area. Again, not always, but typically. So in this case, we would expect the minister in charge of this area, the Minister for Housing, Planning and Local Government, to introduce this bill to the House, the Housing Bill 2017. And then it would go through a 5-stage process of debate. And again, there is more detail on these 5 stages in the handout that was circulated to you. But the Dáil would debate the bill, first of all, in the broad principles surrounding the bill. The Dáil might ask, what is the nature of this housing problem? What kind of measures do we usually use to try and correct problems with housing supply? What sort of rules should we use to try and make sure this problem is solved? Should we use broad rules or narrow commands? Questions like that. But then as the debate moves on, the Dáil will focus on the minute detail, not on those broad questions, but on the language of this particular bill. Does this language do what we want it to do? Will it solve the problems we want to solve? And throughout this process, TDs can offer changes to the bill, amendments, to try and improve the bill in either big or small ways. And so the bill might change while it's going through the Dáil and this 5-stage process of debate. At the end of that process, there is a vote where the Dáil will decide to either reject our housing bill, and it will end there, or accept it, pass it, in which case we'll have cleared our first step in the lawmaking process. We would then move on to step 2, where we would go to the other house of the Oireachtas, the Seanad, the consultative chamber, indirectly elected in the main by other politicians. And it would go through the same 5-stage process of debate. Start with the broad principles, move on to the detail. And at the end of that process, the Seanad can do one of 3 things. It could pass the bill, exactly as the Dáil presented it to them. It could reject the bill, saying it does not think the bill should be passed at all. Or it could return it to the Dáil with suggested amendments. But it's very important to note, the Seanad does not have a power of veto in this process. It can only advise, it can only consult. And that means that if the Dáil is offered amendments by the Seanad, the Dáil could accept them, or it can reject them and pass the bill the way the Dáil thinks best. Similarly, if the Seanad rejects the bill outright, which almost never happens, it's happened twice in the history of the state, in the event this happens, the Dáil can overrule the Seanad and pass the bill notwithstanding the objection. So let's imagine the Seanad does pass our bill, and the housing bill will then have passed through our second step. We then move on to step 3, and we send the bill to the President. The President has 7 days to decide to do one of 2 things. Either sign the bill, in which case it becomes an act, the Housing Act 2017. It is given the force of law, and we can start to implement the changes that we have put in that bill. Or the President could decide to refer the bill to the Supreme Court to test its constitutionality. And we'll return to that very important power in just a minute. But it's important to note that the President, like the Seanad, has no power to veto a bill. The President can choose to sign it immediately or to refer it to the court before signing it. But the President cannot simply decide not to sign it. Let's imagine anyway that our bill is passed and we have achieved some class of victory in that. But what if, rather than passing an entirely new law, we wanted to change an older law that was on the books? Well, the process is in essence the same. To change any existing law, you have to go through the same 3-step process. You have to pass a new act through both houses of the Oireachtas and get it signed by the President. And so let's imagine there is an older law on housing that we need to change in order to effect the changes that we want to make in our new act. Well, we still have to pass the Housing Bill 2017, but we could do one of 2 things with that older law in that bill. We could repeal the old law and replace it, that is, take it away entirely and say the only relevant law on housing now is this new housing bill. Or we could decide to amend the text of that older law, changing what that old law means, what it does, perhaps in very substantial ways. but the old law would still exist as amended. Essentially then, changing an older law is done by the same process as passing an entirely new one. So that's the lawmaking process in theory. But what about the practice of it? Who actually controls this process? Because if I were to describe the process to you as I just have, you might say that clearly the power in this process rests solely with the Oireachtas. They are the ones with all the power, the Dáil and the Seanad. But the reality is that, generally speaking, much of the time, the government has a great deal of control over this process. Why? Because the government usually controls a majority of seats in both the Dáil and the Seanad. Not always, and we'll come back to that. But if the government enjoys this majority, it can do many things to control the process. It can control the introduction of bills and the content of those bills, what the bills tend to say. It can defeat any bills introduced by anyone other than the government if it does not like those bills, if it does not want to proceed with them. It can vote those bills down using its majority of votes. And similarly, it can reject any changes or amendments it does not approve of, that it does not like. And so the government, in practice, tends to exercise quite a bit of control over how laws are passed through the houses of the Oireachtas. However, it's important to note that some recent developments have given more power back to the Oireachtas, and so it's slightly different at the moment. Some of these are structural changes in how the Oireachtas does its business. A new process called pre-legislative scrutiny has been introduced by the last government and continued by this government. And this allows Oireachtas committees to discuss proposals for legislation while they are still in their formative stages. And so this has given the Oireachtas a new influence over how bills come together, over what is actually in these bills. And that has given new powers to the Oireachtas that previously perhaps lay with the government. But also, as I'm sure you're aware, we currently have a minority government, meaning the government does not have a majority of seats in the Dáil. And without that majority of seats, that means the government cannot ensure that its own bills will be passed unless it secures other votes from members of the opposition. The government cannot be sure that it can vote down any other bills that it does not like unless it secures support from the opposition. And the government cannot reject amendments to its bills that it does not like, again, unless it secures support from other people. So essentially that means our current legislative process is much more collaborative, with the government working with the Dáil in a much more active way rather than controlling the process. Whether or not that's something that is unique to our current political situation, or whether that might continue because it's a cultural change in how the Oireachtas does its work, that's something only time will tell. But generally the government exercises quite a bit of control, but it's important to note it doesn't right now. So, that's making and changing laws in brief. But we mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, laws have to conform with the Constitution. They have to be constitutional. How do we make sure that they are? How do we know that the laws we pass are constitutionally acceptable? Let's imagine, going back to our housing bill, that people raise constitutional questions about what we want to do. It's not difficult to see how this might happen. Let's imagine we decided to impose a very strict rent restriction on landlords. Let's say landlords in a certain part of Dublin cannot charge more than X thousand euro for rent. A very strict cap on rents. Probably unlikely that any bill would contain such a provision, but let's imagine for our purpose that it did. That would raise constitutional questions, because everyone enjoys private property rights under the Constitution. Those are protected. And by restricting how landlords use their properties, what they can charge, we would be restricting those property rights. Now, property rights are not absolute. We can restrict them in the common good, but questions would be raised about this provision. Can we do this? Is this something that is constitutionally permissible, or does it unfairly restrict the property rights of landlords? Well, how would we know this? How would we figure it out? There are three mechanisms to try and ensure that the laws that we pass are constitutional. The first two mechanisms try and ensure that we don't pass a law that is unconstitutional, try and nip the problem in the bud. The third mechanism solves the problem in the event that we do pass a law that violates the Constitution. The first mechanism is the advice of the Attorney General. The Attorney General is the government's chief legal advisor, and she advises the government on whether any bill or proposal might violate the Constitution. She will give advice on any bill coming through the Oireachtas or being considered, and whether or not that might create constitutional problems. So we have some advance notice of constitutional issues arising with a bill. Now, there are a few issues with this. First of all, the Attorney General's advice is only that. It's advice. She cannot say definitively if a bill is constitutional or not. That is not the power of the Attorney General. However, the government will very rarely proceed with any piece of legislation that the Attorney General has advised might be unconstitutional. So if the Attorney General says that it is impermissible to go forward with this rent restriction, it will very likely not go forward. So the Attorney General has a great deal of influence in this respect. Finally, then, in this context, the Attorney General's advice is generally not published, though it has been published on certain occasions. And this has raised some controversy because parliamentarians sometimes feel they should be allowed to see the advice, to know why they are being told they should not legislate in a certain way. However, despite the limitations on this, it's a very useful process for making sure that the laws we are passing do not have constitutional issues in them. The second process, then, is something we mentioned earlier, the reference of bills to the Supreme Court by the President. You might remember we said the President can either sign a bill immediately or refer it to the Supreme Court to test its constitutionality. So, if the President requests it, the Supreme Court will consider every provision of our housing bill and ask all sorts of questions about whether or not the provisions are constitutional. If the Supreme Court finds any single provision to be unconstitutional, then the President cannot sign the bill. The bill will never become a law in this form. The bill is dead in the water. Now, if we want to pass another housing bill, we'll have to go back to the drawing board and go through the whole process again to try and avoid these constitutional problems in our next attempt. However, if the Supreme Court gives our bill the okay, says it is constitutional, then we have a final and definitive answer. We know for sure that the bill is constitutional, and never again can we raise questions over that bill. So it's a very useful process because it tells us definitively, before a law comes into force, is there a constitutional problem with it? But it is sort of an exceptional process. We don't use it very often. It's only been used 15 times in the history of the state, most recently a little more than a decade ago. So it's not something that is done with great regularity, but it is a very useful process. Finally then, if a bill passes, so in spite of these mechanisms, a bill passes that might have a constitutional problem in it, then citizens can challenge that act in the courts. So if our bill is not referred to the Supreme Court, an ordinary citizen can bring a challenge to the courts saying, I believe this law to be unconstitutional. Generally speaking, that citizen will be personally affected by the law. So in our situation, probably a landlord subject to this rent restriction might take a case. That case is taken in the High Court, and on appeal can be brought to the Court of Appeal and perhaps ultimately the Supreme Court. And the citizen will have to try and convince the courts that there is a constitutional issue, that their rights are unfairly being restricted. And if the court is convinced by any of those arguments, the court can invalidate any provision of the Act that it thinks is unconstitutional, but only that provision of the Act. So unlike with the reference of the bill from the President, the rest of the Act can survive. The courts will only invalidate that part that has a constitutional problem. But if the court invalidates any section, any provision, that provision is null and void. It can never be used again. It has no force and effect. So if our landlord succeeds in their constitutional challenge, that would mean that the rent provisions will cease to apply. The constitutional problem is solved. So those are the mechanisms we use to ensure that laws are constitutional. One very final thing before I leave you. We can, of course, change the Constitution. And how do we go about doing that? Well, at the start, the process is the same. Constitutional amendments begin just like any other bill. They are debated and passed first by the Dáil, then by the Seanad, with the Seanad having no veto. But before going to the President, they then must be approved by a majority of voters voting in a referendum. And only if the majority of voters approve the change can the President sign the bill and the Constitution be changed. And this process allows us to change what the Constitution says, to give the Oireachtas new powers that it doesn't have at the moment, perhaps, or to take away lawmaking power in an area the Oireachtas currently does have power over. So ultimately, we can change the Constitution in that way if we wish. So in conclusion, the Constitution gives out lawmaking power, but it does so with this very important proviso. That power can only be used once the Constitution is respected. And we have these several mechanisms in place to try and make sure that the fruits of that process, the laws that we ultimately pass, respect those rights and values in our highest law, which obviously will remain the Irish Constitution. Thank you very much. I hope this has been useful to you.